Good morning. Thanks for staying this morning. Thanks for putting up with no lights early on. We were a little nervous about what we were going to do today when we first got here. I got here about 7 o'clock, and power was off, and I was frantic and trying to figure out how in the world are we going to survive today. But God stepped in and gave us light right in time, and so, Lee, you doing well?
I'm doing fine. Doing well. I think since our lesson, the direction it's going today, it sounds to me as though God had a plan. This is a great opportunity for an illustration for class. So
you'll see what we mean in a moment. Okay, so we're in the Sermon on the Mount, and last week we were finishing up the Beatitudes, and Lee, I wanted to go back and just kind of touch base on that last one. I felt like we had to fly through it, and I didn't want to do that simply because it may be something that we desperately need to hear. This is the last one of where Jesus turns very personal to everybody. Blessed are you. Up until now, it was blessed are poor in spirit, they that mourn, whatever. But now he goes, blessed are you, and then specifically, he talks about things that you might have to endure because you choose to be godly. So blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, falsely say all kinds of evil against you. Notice that, falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. And so, you live long enough in this old world, we're going to get some of that. I think we'll get more of it as we go. I think that's one of the challenges that we find in America is what you experienced in Scotland when you were over there. Just kind of recap that again, some of the stuff y'all had to deal with.
Yeah, well, some of it was sometimes when you were going out door knocking or things like that, you would at times get insulted, called various names. Of course, being from the United States, I was often told to go back home, that they didn't really need me here. And then some of the other things that happened, sometimes at where we had our worship services at the building, there were oftentimes, people during the worship services, people would be banging on the doors, banging on the walls. There was graffiti constantly on the walls, on the outside. We had rocks thrown. One actually went, in the middle of the worship service one time, went through a window right in the middle of the service. So, there's things like that.
Kind of like balloons popping.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Another great move by God, I think, to give an illustration. So.
I'm glad only one popped, but and I'm glad Megan warned me ahead of time. We're going to experience more persecution. What degree it becomes more and more difficult, I don't know. But we're going to be forced to take a stand. And if you take a stand for biblical principles, you're going to be put in a class of people that people are they're going to hate you. They're going to talk about you. They're going to persecute you. And so we just need to be prepared for what is coming. I know for a fact it's coming. I see other preachers who are already running into it, and I'm like, wow. And state universities is not unusual at all to run into it. Again, one of the things I talked about was my son when he was working for a university out in San Antonio. The LGBTQ community came in and began literally going from office to office and saying, Are you in favor of LGBTQ rights? Or are you against it? And if you said against it, then they would start boycotting you and protesting you. And of course, my son wasn't a teacher, but he was director of all of the technologies at the university. And I asked him, I said, what are you going to do if they come to your office? And he said, well, I'm just going to have to tell them where I stand, and we'll see what happens. Now, fortunately for him, they just targeted the professors at that particular time. But at some point in time, we will be targeted as well. And his point is rejoice and be glad. And Lee, of all the things I struggle with is how to rejoice when I'm being persecuted.
Yeah, that never was high on my list of responses when things happened. The last thing I was thinking about was rejoicing about it. But yeah, exactly. I mean, and of course it plays out later. I think we looked at it last week in Acts, with the apostles.
Yeah, the text there.
Again, it's just extraordinary that, rejoicing, and Paul and Silas, when they're thrown in prison, they've been beaten, and Paul's been beaten, and he's a Roman citizen. I mean, he brings that up later on to make a point, and yet instead of feeling sorry for themselves, we see in Scripture that they're singing, they're praying, and people are listening, which kind of is going to lead into this week, being the salt and the light.
Right.
So that's a lesson. I think that's a lifelong lesson. At least it is for me. When things like that happen, is having that kind of attitude of being able to rejoice when you're being persecuted for being a Christian. So
one of the things that we had as far as persecution was concerned years ago here in the South was, of course, racial persecution. And one of the great preachers was Marshall Keeble. Some of y'all have heard of the name Marshall Keeble, perhaps. Anybody ever heard Marshall Keeble? Okay, several of you have heard Marshall Keeble. Willie Cato was Marshall Keeble's Anglo minister who traveled with him on his campaigns. And what Brother Willie would do is he would go into a community where Brother Keeble was preaching. He would go and get a hotel room, and then he would sneak Brother Keeble in. And that's the only way he could they could get in a hotel room. If you've ever watched, there's a book, The Green Book. Is it The Green Book? Y'all, yeah. The Green Book. The Green Book was a book that existed back in the 50s of hotels that would accept African American people as opposed to, rejecting them. Well, Brother Cato tells the story one time of sneaking Brother Keeble into a hotel room and them getting ready to go to bed that night and knock on the door, and he goes to the door, and it's the manager of the hotel, and he's livid. You've got, and you can imagine the racial slurs that were said, y'all need to get out of here now, and literally threw them out in the middle of the night. And Brother Cato was just as furious as he could be, and Brother Keeble simply said to him, "Don't worry about it, it's all right, it's going to be okay." And then the rest of the story, years and years later, after Brother Cato had died, I got to know Brother Cato. And by the way, Brother Cato preached here at Hendersonville at one time. Way back in the 50s, I believe. But anyway, years and years later, Brother Cato's daughter was at Lipscomb Lectures. And someone came up to her and said, "Are you Willie Cato's daughter?" Said, "Yes." And said, "You don't know who I am, but my father threw your dad and Brother Keeble out of a hotel one night. And we, after that, obeyed the gospel, and I just wanted to come by and tell you how sorry on behalf of my family because of what my dad did so many years ago." Isn't that amazing how God works through that? And so rejoice and be glad. Why? First of all, because great is your reward in heaven. It's not about what we get here. It's what we get there. And then, and of course, 2 Corinthians, our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. And of course, when you see what all Paul went through, light and momentary.
Yeah, I would hate to see Paul's description of something that was heavy and burdensome.
Yeah, because I know he was beaten at least a couple of times with 39 stripes. 40 save one, and so just really amazing what he endured. But then he goes on and says, "For in the same way they persecuted the prophets that were before you." And so you get this link up with those who had gone before. And by the way, and I put in here, including John the Baptist. I mean, John the Baptist is still fresh on everybody's mind. they still believed John to be a prophet. And of course, John was executed because he dared to challenge Herod Antipas taking his brother Philip's wife. And so they were still being persecuted. And so we're persecuted in the same way.
And with that, that always brings to mind, Hebrews 11, with just particularly the description toward the end of the book, what happened to the prophets. Some were, they were slain, they were torn in two, they were thrown down, just horrendous things to happen to them. And yet all of that happens and they remain faithful.
Yeah.
Their confidence was in God. And that type of faith, for one thing, embarrasses me to think about, how would I have reacted to that. But at the same time, it also, I think, reinvigorates or encourages me. It's like, okay, here's some great examples of men and women who died for their faith in God. That has got to be a motivation for me to live that life too.
Yeah. I always love, Lee, the story of Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego when they're arrested, and basically you either worship the image or I'm going to throw you in the fiery furnace. And they look at Nebuchadnezzar and they said, listen, our God is able to save us, whether he will or not. Mm-hmm. And even if he doesn't, we will not worship your image. I love that courage they had. Our God is able. Doesn't mean he will.
But he's still God.
But he's still God. And that was one of the things I was trying to get across. I don't know how well I did that this morning, Lee, in the lesson. But I'm trying to get across that we never know what God is doing in the midst of a tragedy we're going through. Is this just a tragedy we're enduring? Or is this something that God is working through in a very special way to accomplish something? And looking back, sometimes we are like, ooh, yes. And then other times we're like, I don't know. Mm-hmm. But, trying to figure out, God, what are you doing? And, of course, this side of eternity, we'll never know completely.
No.
And I'm not sure Job knew,
No, but he, he had his challenges. So much happened to him. Of course, part of his issue was maybe his attitude toward things, a bit. But at the end of the day, he's like, God, you're God. You don't need to explain yourself to me.
Yeah.
Who am I? And God ends up lifting him up.
Yeah.
He says, "This is my servant Job, who is faithful." Yeah.
Notice this statement up here: persecution will not come unless we are following Jesus publicly. This is going to be the transition between the Beatitudes and the next just 3 or 4 verses. They're some of the most well-known verses in all the Bible. Okay? But basically the point Jesus is going to make is that if you take a public stand for me, you can anticipate persecution. And so will you publicly say, I am a follower of Jesus of Nazareth? I know I have been questioned about this because I ran into this working out at the prison. Back about right before COVID, I'm out at the prison one night, and the man that I mentor is kind of the leader of the church there. A lot of people don't realize, but there's a church at River Bend, maximum security prison. Has about 10 to 12, 15 members. Meets every Sunday when they have enough guards there. I was supposed to preach there a couple of weeks ago and was getting ready to go out to River Bend. And one of the fellow ministers called me and said, don't go out. They're not letting anybody in. They don't have enough guards. And so if you've been by a restaurant lately that couldn't serve you because they didn't have enough waiters and waitresses or cooks, they also don't have enough guards at our maximum security prison. I mean, they can't even hold church services there sometimes because of a shortage of guards. But anyway, I'm out there, and the leader of the little church out there, he said, I need to ask you a question. I said, sure. He said, I've been studying with a guy, and he wanted to be baptized. And I said, okay, so what's the problem? Well, he didn't want anybody in the prison to know it. And I'm like, why did he not want anybody in the prison to know it? And he said, well, because he's the leader of the largest gang in the prison. Now, does that seem contradictory to you? It did to me. I mean, I'm sitting there going, okay, if you want to be baptized, but you want to be baptized in secret because you want to continue to be the leader of the gang, you can't do both. You can't do both. You can't continue being the guy who everybody comes to and who orders. And listen, a lot of things go on in prison. You know what it's like if you've heard the stories, and a lot of them are true. And I told him, I said, one of the things that Jesus demanded is that if we are not willing to confess him in front of men, he's not willing to confess us. We cannot be a secret disciple of Jesus. You just can't do it. Now, if you're living in a world like Saudi Arabia and you're a disciple underground, I get that. Okay, I'm getting it where you're trying to keep from the whole community being wiped out. But as far as your Christian witness around those around you has got to be there. And so it's a big challenge that sometimes people have. And so we move to this next one where we're talking about how do we be a Christian witness in the world. So why don't you take off, Lee?
Yeah, you are the salt of the earth. You're the light of the world. And to me, it's fascinating. And again, it's just God's plan. Just got through talking about if you're going to be a follower of me, you're going to, and you're going to be a public follower of me. You're going to face persecution. You're going to face tribulation. Things are going to happen. Rejoice when those things happen. Well, if you're going to be the salt of the earth, and if you are going to be the light of the world, it's just a natural following. These things will happen. Salt. When we think about it as far as food is concerned, we think of it as either as it adds some flavor, or it can be a preservative, at times. That's, to me, is kind of where we're looking at as far as us as Christians. We have to be a flavor for the world. We have to help preserve things. The world, and I think we'll see it again with the light as well, but the world needs something. The light of the world. What is the light does? Well, the light, it provides, obviously, a way to see in the dark.
We saw it this morning.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Great illustration.
I'm up here in the pulpit with my phone trying to see if I could read, out of the text. I wasn't going to be able to read my Bible. Wasn't enough light in here.
Yeah, I remember coming years and years ago when I was in my early 20s, so at least 10 years ago, that I was preaching at a congregation in Murfreesboro, actually, preaching at a congregation there, and I just came to my main point, to my crescendo, if you like, as I was coming to the lesson, and just as I finished it, this huge thunderclap happened, and I stopped and I was like, "Thank you, Lord." That was perfect. That fit in great. But light is, not only does it shine in the darkness, but it exposes the darkness.
Right.
And when we get into that aspect of exposing darkness, that's where we get back also to this idea of, when you may be facing persecution and issues and things like that.
I love this picture I found, Lee. It's a light bulb turned into a salt shaker. And when I saw that, I thought, boy, that is exactly what Jesus is saying here. Your light and your salt all together. And I came across that image, and I thought, I have got to find me one of those. And but a beautiful image. And you mentioned this right here when we were kind of dialoguing back and forth, the importance of Jesus saying you are, as opposed to you should be. Explain that.
Well, just the aspect of, before he was like, blessed are. It wasn't really until the very end was he getting, I guess, if you like, more personal with it, more direct. But here he's direct. You are. I mean, his audience that he's talking to, he's anticipating, expecting them to be this salt of the earth. He's expecting them to be the light of the world. Interestingly enough, it's not the Pharisees, it's not the religious leaders, that's not who's listening to him right now. This is the everyday people coming together, hearing what he has to say, and he puts it to them. You are. This is your calling in life.
One of the things that Lee and I both have the opportunity to do over the years is perform weddings. And preachers have a level of power in weddings that is just amazing. I'm standing there, or Lee's standing there, and we've got this man and this woman here, and all at once we look at them and we say, all right, having made these vows and given and exchanged these rings by the authority vested. Now you have to realize, Lee, it took me forever to realize that wasn't invested. I thought it was invested. I used to say invested, and June said, Leslie, it's not invested, it's vested. And I'm like, okay, I'm not used to using that word. So I had to learn how to say vested, being from Mississippi. But anyway, but by the authority vested in me as a minister of the gospel and by the state of Tennessee, we then, what? Pronounce. You are now husband and wife. 30 seconds earlier, you weren't. Now, you are. And that's all because of the authority vested in us to declare that, which is absolutely amazing to me.
Yeah.
I tell people it's the only thing that you and I do that I've at least thought of where we can have a couple, and nowadays, let me just go ahead and tell you, a lot of couples today, before they get married, they live together. And I have to have conversations with them about that. You can't be living together. God's not happy with that. That's a sin. It's called fornication. And yet, I say to people, it is the only moment when through a declaration that you and I make, they go from being sinners to now being sacred. Mm-hmm. That relationship they're in prior to it would have been sinful. Now it's sacred. And so it's one of those weird authorities that we have, both from God as well as from the civil government.
Yeah, it really is. Not that I would ever do it, but often you get to that point in the service, and you're like, I don't know if I want to do this. Yeah. I'll think about it. Give me a minute.
Give me a week. Yeah. I'll come back next week and declare you husband and wife. Yeah.
But,
I've.
Now, did you see the story that Randy Harris shared in his book about this?
I don't know if I did or not.
Okay. So Randy Harris and his book on the Beatitudes, and he was talking about, he doesn't like doing marriages. It's not his thing. He does them, but it's not really his thing. And a couple came to him, and he was going to be performing the wedding and stuff, and that day they came to him and said, "We need to talk to you about something."
I do remember it
okay.
now. Keep going.
And he said, well, okay, he's going through his mind, what's going on, what's happened. And they said, we actually eloped last week. We got married last week, so we're already married. But will you still do the ceremony? And so he said, well, yeah, okay. And so they go through it, and they get to that point, where normally you would say, I now pronounce you husband and wife. And he actually cuts his mic off. And what does he do?
I forgot.
Oh, you forgot?
Yeah,
okay.
I remember him saying something, but I don't remember what it was.
So he actually cuts his mic off right before he says that, and he says, I pronounce you husband and wife again.
Yeah.
It's like, again. And of course, nobody else heard it except them up there,
right.
And everybody afterwards was going to them and said, what did he say to you? Because the man and the woman just broke into hysterics, laughing about it. So
I've had the same situation. I had a couple I was doing premarital counseling with, and they were living together, and I told them, you can't be living together, it's a sin. And they say, well, we're actually married. And I said, wait a minute, what do you mean you're actually married? I'm doing your premarital counseling. And they said, well, we eloped a few weeks ago and got married, but we didn't tell anybody. And we're not going to tell anybody. We want, and so I didn't say again. I went ahead and did that. But yeah, sometimes you find yourselves in that. And here's Jesus saying, you are. I pronounce that. You are salt. You are light. Now, does that mean that we're perfect salt and light? No. In fact, he's going to talk about that as he gets into it. You know, you're the salt of the earth, and you said it preserves and it flavors. How many of y'all, and I know some of you have, how many of you, when you were growing up, your family killed hogs and you preserved the meat? Yeah, we didn't smoke. A lot of people smoked. We used salt and pepper and sugar and rubbed the meat down and would cure it over a period of a week or so and then hang it up. And Lee, one of my craziest memories...
Sorry, my wife just stuck her tongue out when you said that, hanging the meat up and all that stuff.
Oh, yeah. When you grew up on a farm in Mississippi, that's what you did, Joan. Sorry about that. But I remember on many occasions, my grandmother in the morning would be in the kitchen, and I would go and sit with her, and she would be carving a country ham, you know, salt cured, and she would cut off a slice and would eat it. And I'd look at her and I'd go, Grandmother, that's raw. And she'd say, no, honey, it's preserved. And I was like, yeah, but you could die from that. And she said, I'm 86 years old. I don't think so. You know.
I've done it before.
Yes, I've done it before. But I saw her many a time, you know, but it was preserved. And they would have preserved it. And like you said, flavor. Yeah. Man, you know the worst thing in the world without salt?
What?
McDonald's French fries. Have y'all ever got McDonald's French fries and they didn't put any salt on them? I mean, you put one in your mouth and you're like, I can't eat these things. You know, where's the salt? You got to have salt.
I can't imagine being on a no-salt diet.
Yeah.
I mean, I just, you know, Lord, take me now.
Take me now. Now, notice it was also used for currency. One of the things I think we mess up with is we don't realize how easily we get salt. I mean, we have salt everywhere. I mean, you can go to any cabinet in anybody's house and y'all have salt. That wasn't the case in the first century. Salt was a very precious commodity, and so precious that oftentimes soldiers would be paid their salary in salt that they then used to exchange for goods. That's how precious salt was. And by the way, I want you to remind you, Jesus is giving this sermon somewhere near Capernaum. We don't know exactly which hillside. And Capernaum's up here in the north. You'll notice right up here in the top. Now, I want you to notice this road coming down through here. That's a road. That red line is a road. It's called the Via Maris, which means the way of the sea. And it's the only way you can go from up in Syria, up in northern Iraq. If you're going to travel down to Egypt, you would come down that road. And that road came right through Capernaum. Now, I want you to think, when you travel to Gulf Shores or Destin, Florida, where do you stop on the way? Peach Park. Amen, brother. Absolutely. You get that peach ice cream or those peach pies. Where else do you stop? Come on, y'all. Priestler's Pecans. I mean, you got to stop at Priestler's Pecans. You got to get the key lime version. I mean, I go in there, and after about 30 minutes, June said, Leslie, you got to quit sampling the pecans. I'm like, yeah, but they're so good. I mean, Lee, you can just go. Have you ever gone there?
I don't eat nuts.
These are pecans.
I don't eat any of those things.
Now, there's where you need to stick out your tongue. I mean, good night.
I was often accused of, you know, not really being from the South.
You don't eat pecan pie?
No. No.
I quit. I ain't teaching with you anymore. Man, wow.
Well, see, that's when you first asked me about co-teaching with you, I thought there are certain things I need to keep quiet.
Yeah.
Then you brought it up, and
wow.
I just got stuck.
Okay, my point I'm making is this. If you traveled along the Via Maris, guess where you stopped to get fish? You got fish in Capernaum. It was their number one trade. You see, Peter, Andrew, James, and John, they participated in a trade that was huge in Capernaum because you had caravans who were constantly coming through, either coming from Egypt, going to Syria, or coming from Syria, going down to Egypt. And these people needed to buy food. And of course, the food they needed to buy was fish that oftentimes was dried and salted. That's how you preserve the fish. And so Peter and James and John and these guys, they would go and they'd catch the fish, and then they would sell it to the processors who would take it and salt it and dry it out, and then they would then sell it to the merchants that were coming through. And by the way, there was a man by the name of Matthew who would sit there and tax everybody because of all the transactions that was going on. I mean, that's what was going on. And Jesus knew that well. And he knew how important salt was just to the economy of somewhere like Capernaum. So what about this one?
Yeah, if the salt loses its saltiness, how do you make it salty again? If salt for food purposes, if it loses, well, what's it good for? And it's good for nothing, basically. I mean, it gets, as it says later, get trampled.
Trampled. And of course, people look at this, a lot of people do, and they say, wait a minute, salt can't lose its saltiness. Salt cannot be anything less than salt. Salt is salt. Here's what you got to realize, though. You need to understand, y'all, we are so removed from the ancient world that we don't get it. You see, we can go to the grocery store and we can buy what? Pure salt. You're right, Donald. We can go and buy pure salt. The problem in the ancient world is they didn't have pure salt. That's not the way they even thought. In fact, a lot of the salt they would get would come from the Sea of Galilee, would come from the Dead Sea area. And by the way, if you go down there and you get that salt, you're like, well, this is salt. Yes, it's salt, but it's a lot of other things in there too. You see, they did not have the ability to purify it like we do today. And so in Bible times, you might buy a bag of salt and you taste it and it tastes like salt, but not all salt, not by any stretch of the imagination. And Jesus' point simply is if you buy a bag of salt and you open it up and it's not that much salt in it, you'll know it. And so like you said, it'll be trampled underfoot, which is a warning. I think it's a warning to all of us, Lee, that if we're not what God calls us to be, if we're not that salt, then God says, listen, can I tell you what will happen to you? You too will be thrown out.
Yeah, it goes back to that whole idea of, being willing to publicly confess that, you're a Christian, that you are a follower of Jesus. If you're not willing to do that, he's not going to confess you either. So.
Yeah. And then the next one is this one. You are the light of the world. And of course, it's only on days like today that we can appreciate the meaning of that. Some of you remember when you first got electricity. Brother Stretch, how old were you when y'all finally got electricity?
We didn't have electricity in my house when I went into the service.
When you went into the military. I guess when you went to the first base and saw electricity, you thought, this is the coolest thing in the world. You just flip a switch and a light comes on. Yeah. My dad was in the 12th grade, 1950. And they finally ran power to that part of North Mississippi. And, of course, Nashville got electricity. I mean, it was, East Nashville, places like that.
By the way, when does the rest of Mississippi get power?
When does the rest of it get power?
Yeah.
I don't know. They built that wall down there right on the border. Yeah. I mean, I don't know how many of y'all heard about the wall, the president was building. Most people think it was down in Texas. It wasn't. It was right in North Mississippi. Keep people from Mississippi coming up in Tennessee. Yeah, I got out just in time. And by the way, this is the way back then they had light. This is a lamp. And you would have a wick. A wick would just simply be cotton cloth that you would roll up real tight, and you would pour in olive oil. And that's how you lit your houses. It was through olive oil. And that's why olive trees were so important. And that's why you get the story of the 10 virgins, and the fact that some of their oil ran out. Well, that oil was olive oil. And you had to have it, and of course it was a commodity. It was kind of like kerosene. Brother Garland, what did y'all use to light your lamps? Was it kerosene? Kerosene, and I suspect kerosene. You start running out of kerosene, you're like, whoa, keep the lights on. If you run out of kerosene, they couldn't with oil lamps, and so. And by the way, this is why you had to continually take care of the wick. The wick would have run out the top of it. They would have come out the top, come out this end, and as it burnt down, you would have to push the wick a little bit more to keep it lit.
Otherwise, instead of being light, it'd be smoke.
Yeah, it'd start smoking and mess everything up. It's interesting that when Jesus said, "You're the light," Israel was supposed to have been the light to the nations. Look at this text here, Isaiah 42. "I, the Lord, have called you in righteousness. I will take hold of your hand." Now, here he's talking about Jesus in particular. This is one of the servant psalms. "I will keep you and will make you to be a covenant for the people." Lord's Supper today. This is the covenant of Jesus that's talked about here. "And a light for the Gentiles." And the reason he says that is because, Lee, the Jews never were a light to the Gentiles. Not what they were supposed to be.
Yeah, because it's interesting. You look back through the Old Testament and you see, how they were supposed to have treated foreigners, and coming through, how they're supposed to look after and be a light.
Yes.
And like I say, it just never, at least for the vast majority, it just never clicked. It just did not click that was what was. That's what God was really calling them to do. In fact,
they tried to isolate themselves. We'll talk about that here in just a moment, instead of trying to be the light. But he says a town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Again, y'all, we are so used to light. I mean, when was the last time you were somewhere that was really dark? I mean, think about that. Any of y'all have night lights at your house? I mean, I can walk anywhere in my house any time of night and not stumble because I got little lights plugged in everywhere. June, wants me to be able to see. We don't live in a dark world anymore. Now, I remember as a teenager outside of Mississippi, outside of Ripley, where I grew up, Lee, that at night, if it was cloudy, you couldn't see hardly anything. I mean, it was dark. And so, growing up in a culture where you have plenty of light. My dad used to tell the story, Lee, of when he was a kid, of having to go fetch water up at the spring. And the spring was about 50 yards away from the house. And he would have to go at night sometime, and he said if it was dark, I mean, you just kind of had to feel your way up there. And he said one of the things that happened on more than one occasion is he'd be up there getting a bucket of water, and a bobcat would scream. Now, I've never heard a bobcat scream. And by the way, just so that y'all know, June and I were down at Neely's Bend, Peeler Park last week, and the ranger was saying that a bobcat had been seen on Neely's Bend. And I'm like, ooh, wow. I doubt there's been a bobcat on Neely's Bend in a long, long time. But be in the dark and to hear something scream like that, wow.
Well, and it was, something like this. It reminds me back in, it would have been the early 1990s, the ice storm. Mm-hmm. And I remember being outside and had the dog out, to take care of business. And all around you keep hearing this, crack, pop, crack, crack. The oddest thing, all the neighborhoods around ours lost power and lost it for days. Our neighborhood never lost it. It flickered probably 100 times, but we never lost it. But you'd go out and you'd be out somewhere at night and driving back, and it was just, it was eerie. It was just pitch black until you saw our neighborhood, and there was this little band of light right in that neighborhood.
And if you could imagine being a Jew in the first century and you're trying to travel at night, I mean, how do you see anything, especially if it's cloudy? And of course, the answer is you see the city. You see in the distance, you see that city that's lit up, or you see that house that's lit up. That gives you, okay, I can make it to that spot. I can see where I'm going because of that light. And so, again, because of the way we're raised, we don't appreciate just how significant this is. And neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. But instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. You don't take a basket like this and put it on top of a lamp. First of all, it'd burn the basket.
Right.
But you see, again, the lamp and the fact that you don't hide the light. What you do is you put it on a stand somewhere. And most houses had the little ledges like this. And that's where the oil lamps would be. And that's how you would have light in the room. Of course, it wouldn't be good light, you know. But it'd be enough light that you could at least see to, do whatever you needed to do as you got ready to go to bed at night. And so, take this part, because this is an important part that you and I talked about.
Yeah, in the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. People have to see that you're a Christian. They've got to see that I'm living in a different perspective than what the world lives. But at the same time, I have to have the right attitude about it. Glorify your Father in heaven. These deeds aren't for my glory. They're not like, as Jesus would refer to the Pharisees. Well, don't go around. If you're fasting, don't go around making it look like you're fasting. Don't have a long face. Don't do all these things. Wash your face. Look as if you're not fasting, because the glory is to God, not to me. And I think that's one of the things that we have to get back, or I have to remind myself, is the things that I do aren't about me. They're not about me. And it just comes down to attitude. Are we going to be light enough that people see that there's a difference between the world and me? And then, if that's the case, why am I doing it? If I'm doing it for my glory, well, as Paul says, it doesn't really matter who's preaching. As long as the message is being preached and people are being saved, that's fine. But the folks who are preaching for the wrong reasons, they're going to have to answer to God on their own, in their own way.
Yeah. And it leads to a couple of questions. And like you said, the key is who gets the credit here, because we want to glorify God. And our time is up, but let me end with these two questions. Are Christians so separate from the world that they can't make any difference in the world? You see, one of the things that can happen to us if we're not careful is we can be like the Amish. We just withdraw so much from the world that there's no salt being poured into the world, there's no light being streamed into the world, and so we don't have an impact. That's why you saw Jesus eating with tax collectors and sinners. And Lee, I have to admit, I still struggle. I still struggle to go into some places as light and salt. My brother came up from Mississippi this last Thursday and Friday, and Friday we took them downtown. They'd never been downtown Nashville. Okay, they'd never walked down Broadway, and so we went and walked down Broadway. And we're walking down through there, and we'd walked, a block or so, and my brother just kind of looked at me, and he said, "So it's just bar after bar after bar after bar?" And I said, "Yeah." And of course, I took him to Tootsie's. I said, "Right here, right beside the old Grand Ole Opry. I mean, this is where all the great stars went. You want to go in?" He said, "No." Yeah, I've never been in there, And of course, you're kind of like, it depends on why you go in. And Jesus went into places that the Pharisees looked at him at and said, "How dare you associate with those type of people?" But he goes in as the physician,
Exactly.
as the one.
Yeah, I've gone into places that normally I would not go into, but because there was a situation that someone needed help, you go in. Now, what people think of you after that, well, that's up to them. Hopefully, if they saw that, they would come to me and say, "Hey, was everything okay? What was going on?" But at the end of the day, I'm doing what I think God called me to do, was to help someone in a situation that they needed help to get out of.
And it didn't stop Jesus from getting criticized as a wine bibber and a glutton and a friend of tax collectors. Let me go back to this text. One of the things Jesus prayed is that we not be taken out in the world. Father, I pray not that you take them out of the world. I need them to be in the world. I need them to be the salt. I need them to be the light. Salt has no good if it's not rubbed into the meat. It's that simple. And so the same thing is true of light. If you have a light but you don't turn it on, You know, what good is it? And then here's the other flip side of that. Have Christians become so much like the world that they're not different enough to make a difference? And so, you know, are we engaged in the world? That question has to be answered. Or have we become so much like the world that the world can't tell us apart? And that's what probably bothers me, Lee, more than anything else.
That's the thing. I just see it so often, and it's easy to get pulled into that. I mean, it's easy to get pulled into that because you start to kind of justify. Well, you know, if I don't bring this up right now, if I don't make a stand right now, maybe I can have an influence on them later. And like, but then you start to think, no, I can't. My influence is gone. By that point, my influence is gone. I can't make a difference if I'm compromising. You know, and hey, are there going to be people who aren't going to like that? Absolutely. A lot of people won't like it. A lot of people will persecute or whatever. But again, that's not my problem. My calling is, and a Christian's calling is to be the light, and sometimes that light does expose darkness. It exposes, sin. Now, does that mean that you do a Jonathan Edwards, sinners in the hands of an angry God kind of thing? I don't think that's what we're called to do. I think what Jesus, his example so often was, you need to make a change, but I love you. Tells the woman caught in adultery, go, I'm not going to condemn you, go.
But leave your life of sin.
Yeah, don't. He didn't just say go, he said go and sin no more. And I think that's the direction that we have to try to go to.
Yeah, I love J.B. Phillips' translation of Romans 12. Actually, it's verse 2, not verse 1. Don't let the world around you squeeze you into its own mold. That's what we've got to avoid. All right. Thank you again for being here. Appreciate it so much. Lee, why don't you lead us in prayer?
God, we do thank you for this day. We thank you for your blessings. We thank you for your word. We're thankful that we can have the opportunities of coming together and learning more each day. And we pray that the message, that the lessons that we learn, the messages that we hear, we will be able to share those with those that we meet, those that we come in contact with. Sometimes we may think that changing the world is just overwhelming, but it's changing one person at a time. That's what we're to be about. And we just ask that for your guidance, for your strength, for your courage. Pray you will be with us through the rest of this week. Help us to honor and glorify you. And again, we just thank you so much that you love us. And indeed, you love each person in this world. And help us to remember that as we go out into the world.